Hi everyone, here I am again, the director of our New Zealand registered not-for-profit charitable educational trust called Common Knowledge. And we also hold all of the birthing better skills that I and hundreds of families developed in the early 1970s for absolutely all births, for all births. Now today in this You in Childbirth series, we're going to talk about birth and birth coaching skills. I have a long list of topics to talk about, and I'm going to do one every day or every few days to help you understand why the childbirth conversation today is so crazy and how it started to become crazy. And it started to become crazy when I gave birth in 1970. And it was crazy because three wonderful obstetricians made a decision to start to separate women, pregnant women, birthing women, and that was a mistake. Okay, so the mistake was to separate low risk from high risk women. The other mistake was trying to create childbirth where there was no medical care as versus to medical care. So let me rephrase what Lamaze and Bradley and Grantley Dick Reed could have said, because now in hindsight, everything's 2020. So what do we know is true? We know women are either pregnant or not. We know that. I'm not pregnant. I'm not about to be pregnant. But we know a fact. It's a truth, okay? And since we're living in the world of a lot of information, we have to stick to some truths. What is the truth about pregnant women? We all give birth. 100% of pregnant women throughout time and throughout space and throughout places in the world will give birth. 100% of pregnant women will give birth one way or another. And what's another truth? 100% of pregnant women who are giving birth, it's an activity that each woman does with her baby. No matter where she gives birth, no matter who's present at the birth, no matter her circumstances, no matter her beliefs, no matter the choices, the lack of choices, the change of choices, and no matter what happens to or around that individual woman at a birth. So we know there are two truths. 100% of pregnant women will give birth, and we know that it's an activity each of us does with our baby. Now, this is where my 50 years of perspective, I'm here to help you understand. So these three wonderful obstetricians who developed skills, and I gave birth during a skills-based childbirth trend. In fact, the first childbirth preparation classes taught anywhere in the world were all skills-based. Because there's another truth around childbirth that we need to understand. There are really two factors. One is women suffering. Women suffering in childbirth has never, ever meant a problem. It means that women don't cope. And how does the medical response deal with that? Pain relief. Okay? Pain relief isn't really a medical issue, even if you're in a car accident. Right? Pain relief is to reduce the suffering, the pain. So you need to understand that there's a component of suffering. That was experienced by many, and still is, many, a high percent of women who give birth. High percent of women who give birth suffer, even if they have a short labor, even if everything's fine, even if there's no problem. If we do not cope with the natural and normal occurring pain of labor contractions and we lack skills, we suffer. It hurts. We hate it. We think we're going to die. We're so glad it's over with. Right? So the other part are risks. There is no general risk in childbirth. It's specific. You may have multiple risks, but you don't have every risk. So when someone says, oh, there might be a risk, you have to determine what is your risk. So for example, if you just don't have twins, you do not have a twin problem. If your baby isn't breech, there's no risk. There can be a risk to a head-down baby, and it may be a similar risk, but it's not defined in the same way. So you have to determine, Are you a very young woman or an older woman? Those are perceived of as risks. Do you have diabetes? Is that perceived of as a risk? Do you have, I don't know, one lung, bifurcated uterus? I mean, whatever. If there is a risk, you need to take that in consideration. That's appropriate to take it in consideration. So what do we know? There's suffering, has nothing to do with risks. There's risks. Some risks can become problems, but not all problems lead to disasters. So risks that lead to disasters are infinitely tiny, infinitely tiny. And compared to the number of women who suffer, it is minuscule. So when Bradley, Lamaze, and Grantley Dick Reed set up the first childbirth preparation classes based on skills, sadly, they focused on low-risk women who, if they learned those skills, could achieve a natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical interventions. That was very narrow. Those goals are very narrow, and they're never going to be achieved by the largest number of people. And in the United States, where I gave birth in 1970, I was in the middle of that childbirth trend from the 60s to the mid-70s, which meant throughout the United States, big country, multiple millions of mothers and fathers, because we wanted fathers to come in. So we were the first generation that the fathers came in and helped. And we expected them to be our birth coach because we had been left alone in labor before without any skills, and more of us suffered. And when women suffer in childbirth, it does have a lingering impact. We feel out of control. And we don't feel we've done our best. But if we don't know how to do our best, then we can't do our best. We just get by. Birth happens to us, and we're just glad it's over with. But in that, my generation, in that period of time, from the 60s to the 70s, labor and delivery nurses in the United States, since there were no formalized midwives, and obstetricians, saw multiple millions of women using some skills and fathers helping them. And they didn't see, although they recognized it, they didn't see that using skills was reducing suffering, because the message was these skills are for low-risk women to achieve a natural birth, pain-free labor without medical interventions. And that they could not agree to. They didn't understand that. And I can understand why they didn't understand that. It's not like every risk shows itself well in advance. It's not like back in 1970, the medical profession was as sophisticated as it is now. It's not. In fact, if you had a twin risk or a breech risk, or if you had gestational diabetes, or if you were Rh negative, or any of the billion things, we all labored. There was only a 4.5% cesarean rate. So risks were considered to be normal, natural, and physiological part of pregnancy and childbirth. It was accepted that there were risks. It was accepted that risks could become problems. It was accepted that some problems could become tragedies. And it was accepted that women suffered in childbirth. When there were skills that were promoted across the United States and taught in almost every hospital, women stopped suffering. But because the message was a natural birth message, an anti-medical message, and this idea that you could have a pain-free labor by using skills, then what happened was everybody focused on that. And what happened between 1970, when I gave birth, and my last birth in 1982, was that the childbirth trend changed because the new global natural childbirth movement became very, very vocal, and they decided that they would dismiss skills as succeeding in those narrow goals. And instead, they said skills don't work, and the language they used was simple. Cows and cats aren't taught to birth. Women don't need to be taught to birth. Women have always given birth. We instinctively know how to do it. Some famous authors came up with midwives should sit in a corner and knit, and a famous doctor came up with women should be left alone to discover birth themselves. We had been left alone. We wanted our husbands to help us, for goodness sakes. And fathers were reduced from being a birth coach because the natural birth movement at the time said fathers shouldn't tell women what to do. Women know how to birth. They shouldn't be coaching women. They hated the push, push, push phase, which, yes, that made sense to hate it. But there's something that you need to understand. If you don't like something, you need to understand why, and then you need to replace it with something that you not only like but has better success. So when the natural birth movement became very strong in the 80s, it all became about choices. So back in 1970, when I started to develop these skills with families, families were very, very insistent that I carry forward a concept. And that concept is the concept that I tried for 50 years to carry forward and have been shouted down by the natural birth movement and the midwifery movement. And I decided when COVID came out, I have got to speak up again, because we now have to really consider what we lost when those three wonderful obstetricians did not get the bigger picture. If they had gotten the bigger picture and said 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth, 100% of pregnant women who give birth, each of us is doing an activity with our baby. It's an activity. An activity. What does an activity mean? It means that we either do it with or without skills. It's not about choices. It's not about information. It can be knowledge, but to have skills, you need to learn specific skills. You can't practice before birth. You never know what your birth's going to be like. That's another truth. Your baby will not come to plan. That is another truth. However, your birth will unfold, and it takes time, which means you have plenty of time to apply skills. And if these three obstetricians had said, our primary goal is to just reduce the suffering, we want women to cope, to manage, to work through, to deal with, to handle, to stay on top of, and feel in control as they do the activity of birthing their baby, I would not have to be saying this now, because my generation of women would have said to their sons and daughters, and this is the concept that Birthing Better Families developed in the early 1970s. 100% of pregnant women will give birth. That's the idea. That's the truth. 100% of pregnant women are going to do an activity that they do with their baby. It is normal and natural in pregnancy to learn birth and birth coaching skills that you then use to work through the activity of birthing your baby, no matter where, no matter what, no matter who, no matter the circumstances. That's the concept. And those are the words around the concept, which is different than the concept of the choice-based system, which is women know what kind of birth they want. Women should be able to have the birth they want. They should be able to write that down in a birth plan, and their birth plan should be honored, and birth professionals should try to give women the birth they want. And if birth plans change, women should be involved in the decision-making process, which is fine. It's just a different concept. Those two could have come together back in the 70s. They could have come together. They should have come together. But they didn't come together because the goal was so narrow. Natural birth for low-risk women, pain-free labor with no medical care, no medical assessments, no medical monitoring, no medical procedures that were all now called interventions. And if you want to know how many there are, read this list. So the natural birth movement basically was saying to women, say no to 30 things in order to achieve these three narrow goals. It was too hard back then. It's too hard now. It has been responsible for this rise of shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger, frustration, and emotional birth trauma. We have to stop this. So when COVID started coming, I have come back online because we have this platform now. And I can explain this to you. And why am I explaining it to you as a pregnant woman or a woman that has an interest or has a family member or relative that's pregnant? because you need to give the concept that it is normal and natural to learn birth and birth coaching skills in pregnancy and use those skills as your birth unfolds, because it's an activity that you do with your baby. It's an activity that you do. If you're driving to the hospital, going to be prepped, lying on a table having surgery, it's an activity. This is your baby's birth. You got pregnant to have a baby, not a type of birth. So honor this experience and be skillful in how you work through it. This is not hard. Skills aren't hard to learn. There are a number of skills-based methods. Birthing Better is one, and we have a number of online courses for you to learn. You don't have to go through the order. Pick the skills you like and learn those. If you're pregnant, pick the skills you like. If you're going to be a birth coach, pick the ones you like, and then teach each other. You need to realize this activity has characteristics. It happens. You can't replay it. It's infrequent in our lives. It's a one-off experience. It is life-transforming, and the memories of it last a lifetime. So the natural birth movement elevated it in the sense that it's supposed to be a highlight experience, but they reduced it to a belief that you could choose what you want and that you didn't need to have skills to work through the activity. So we want you to work through the activity of birthing your baby. The simplest skills to learn are breathing skills. The next simplest skills to learn are relaxation skills. From a Birthing Better viewpoint, when we developed the skills in the early 1970s, because the cesarean rate was so low, we focused on the coping. So we didn't suffer. Lamaze, Bradley, and Grantley Dick Reed methods were the beginning. So they weren't very sophisticated. They didn't work for a lot of us, and they weren't directed to most of us. So Birthing Better families developed skills that were very extensive, and they were based on the gaps that we individually felt. So for instance, if a couple felt that they didn't work together, then we developed teamwork skills. If women didn't feel that the breathing skills worked, then we worked on how could we develop breathing skills that worked for everybody. If fathers wanted to touch us in labor to help us not suffer if we looked like we were out of control and we didn't like their touch, then we developed the right touch in the right place in the right time so that we could. If we told stories about how early contractions were fine, then they got more intense, then they got more intense, then they got overwhelming, then I lost it, we had to then look at what was a contraction. And fathers then realized, looking at birth from the outside, that they each had 5 phases. They started, they went up, they peaked, they went away, they came down and went away. So we could use skills in any of those 5 phases. And then we started to notice something 10 years into developing these skills, because the cesareans were classical cesareans. And by the beginning of the 80s, after we had been developing these skills, several things were occurring at the same time. We wanted our husbands to be with us in a cesarean, but they couldn't be because we were given a general anesthetic, and a cesarean was major abdominal surgery. We were cut from our pubic bone to our navel. We began to wear bikinis. We didn't want to be left with an ugly scar. So the medical profession came up with a bikini cut. They didn't develop it on their own. We demanded it as consumers. And they came up with it. They responded to our demands. And they just responded to demands of fathers being with us by developing spinals and then epidurals. We also, some of us that had cesareans, wanted to try for vaginal birth. It was called a trial of labor. With a classical cesarean, there was a risk of our uterus rupturing. With a bikini cut or a low-line incision, that risk was reduced. And so we were able to then have a trial of labor or to try to have a vaginal birth after cesarean. And that was good. And what we also noticed in the early 70s is the medical profession became more sophisticated because we as consumers were concerned about the risks for our babies. If I'm pregnant with a breech baby, I would like to reduce the risks associated to a breech baby. That's true for my twins. That's true for my having gestational diabetes or diabetes. It's true if I'm Rh negative. It's true if I'm strep B positive. So all of these things, if I had a heart problem, if I was older, younger, go on and on about what risks you might have. We, as modern women, started to demand that the medical profession reduce the risks. We know that because at the same time that that was happening around maternity care, it was happening throughout medical care and throughout our society. I grew up during a time where you could drink and drive. I grew up where there were no seatbelts. I grew up when there was no child restraint. I grew up where there were no speed limits on the road. And then consumers started to say, wait a minute. I grew up when there was lead in paint in our houses. So we started to demand as modern people that these risks be reduced or prevented. We did that in healthcare. We did that in maternity care. Why do you think there's immunization? Why do you think there's antibiotics? It's to reduce or prevent the risks from becoming problems. Childbirth is no different, except that for a short period of time, skills were associated to it. And during that period of time, multiple millions of women and men birthed with more dignity and more self-control. So when Birthing Better started, we developed a more sophisticated level of skills. But then in the 80s, when we as consumers demanded less risks in maternity care, and we were wearing bikinis and wanted not to be left with an ugly scar in our belly, and so the bikini cut was developed. When this was happening in our lives, the natural birth movement was removing skills from how we should perceive of birth and just saying we should have choices. As I said, these two should have coupled together. They need to couple together now. And they need to couple together now because with COVID, many women are lacking choices because they're just lacking choices for all sorts of reasons. Those women who want to birth at home because they lack choices need skills. Those women who don't have doulas or their husbands can't or partners can't be with them need skills. But what we saw in the 80s as this transition was occurring was that even with good skills, many of us had a long first or second stage that ended up with more medical care. And so the fathers and mothers of Birthing Better, and this was just a random group. We didn't sit down and sort this out. It was birth after birth after birth after birth. And fathers were the most important in this next phase. Because if we could birth efficiently and effectively, then we were less likely to have a risk that became a problem or a problem that became a tragedy, and we were much less likely to suffer, and we were much less likely to have more medical care because our labor went on and on and on, and we suffered more, we got tired more, and our baby got tired more. So fathers got very clear about it because men are like practical to the nth degree. They took one look at us and said, yeah, you got a big object in that container. Got to open up the container. How do we do that? And from that, for Birthing Better, we developed all of the skills to prepare your body for childbirth starting at 24 weeks. Then fathers, in the brilliance of the human mind of a man who is a partner, who's going to be a father, they were saying 24 weeks of pregnancy were already left behind. And then they developed the 10 skills for the 5 phases of pregnancy that you need to develop through each of the 5 phases of pregnancy from conception through birth. You're still pregnant until your baby has been born. Those skills are on the Udemy platform, Udemy. They're fathers-to-be and mothers-to-be pregnancy academies. So you can find them there. And the reason we did this, the reason skills are so important is as human beings, we don't function as well when we know we lack skills. We thrive on being skilled. We feel more confident, we feel more capable, we feel prouder of ourselves, we have more dignity when we do activities or tasks using skills, and when we can do those well. So what we discovered in working together over a 15-year period by developing all these skills was that Men and women are human beings. Before they're pregnant, they usually feel competent. Then they fall pregnant, and suddenly everybody feels unskilled. They feel uncertain. They've added another human being during this pregnancy. It's a very vague period of time, and people feel unskilled. So we wanted to have a continuity of self, a continuity of skills from pre-pregnant through pregnancy to preparing for birth, through the birth, so that after the birth, we would then feel confident to parent our newborn. This is very important. This is what our trust, common knowledge trust holds. This is the essence of birthing better skills. This is the essence of the concept that it is normal and natural that when you fall pregnant, you self-learn birth and birth coaching skills in pregnancy, and then use skills when you do the activity of birthing your baby. So skills are vitally important. Many of you who listen to this will have used some skills. How did those work for you? If they did not adjust or adapt and they weren't sustainable, they were not sufficient enough. If you used beautiful skills in birth, however, your birth got delayed and it was long and it was tiring, then you did not have the skills to prepare your body, or you had the skills and you chose not to use them. So you need to understand that at the moment, there is no societal message that we should become skilled. Women are not making that choice because they don't know that they should, and they are putting all their time and effort into things like choosing what they want and don't want, creating a birth plan. I follow a number of Facebook groups. One of the active groups is about breech births. And this is where a lack of skills is absolutely highlighted. Yes, breech births have some risks. And when I gave birth in 1970, breech births were labored and you had a vaginal birth. Whether the risk became a problem, whether the problem became a tragedy, it was accepted that way. It was just accepted that way. Medical profession had more hands-on experience. On the other hand, you have to ask questions of ourselves, which most of us don't, because we get pregnant, we have a baby, we forget about it, we may never get pregnant again, is why were forceps used, for example? Because doctors who see our crotches knew that this big object, the size of a grapefruit, the head, or even the butt, if we were tight down there, that big object had trouble coming through. So that's why they did episiotomies, because we were tight, and because the internal soft tissue of our vagina up higher was tight, and it caused our babies to get stuck. That has nothing to do with our pelvis, and that's in Birthing Better, but that's a whole nother factor about the bones in our pelvis or the soft tissue in our pelvis. So the medical profession responded to us all having breech births in 1970 by just doing episiotomy and a forceps delivery or an internal version or a manual extraction of the baby to try to reduce the risks or try to reduce the risks from becoming problems or reduce the problems from becoming a tragedy. So that was actually what was happening. So if women had been skilled, maybe things would have been different. But when we started to demand change in the 80s, we started to demand lots of changes. So women were not as keen to have a vaginal birth with a breech baby or twins. So they were more likely to start to accept to have a cesarean. So the cesarean rate increased as women made choices to reduce the risks. In the breech Facebook pages, now what's happening is women are being told that there's an ideal position for babies to be in. So they are spending heaps of time, heaps and heaps and heaps of time spinning babies, going to people who do the Webster technique, taking homeopathics, getting acupuncture, doing everything they can to turn their baby. And they're spending no amount of time learning skills to prepare their body to open up in case their baby doesn't turn, or even if it does turn. They're spending no amount of time learning skills, how to cope and manage. They're spending no amount of time learning what are the best positions to keep their labor progressive. And there are videos all over the YouTube of breech births. Some of them are beautiful, and some of them, women are in positions that are hindering the descent of their baby, and there are unfortunately some breech births on the internet in which women are in the ideal position of squatting, and by doing so they fix the sacrum, which is the bone that the baby needs to move out, and have ended up with very depressed or dead babies. So you need to understand that your skills are vital to your life. You and your partner, or you and your other, and you and your baby. You owe it to your baby to become skilled. For goodness sakes, you're going to have to become a skilled parent, or you're already a parent and you know that. So you need to be skilled to birth your baby. You and childbirth is about you doing the activity of birthing your baby. You're doing it alone, no matter if you're in a room with 100 people. You have to do it. I had to do it. I made a choice in 1970 to learn Lamaze. Not particularly great skills, whatever, but they were something. And my husband helped me to the best degree that he knew how. I didn't start to develop birthing better because of my disappointment. It was just a particular time in the United States history where people were going around trying to figure this thing called childbirth out. We knew that the conversation was strained, it was confusing, because we knew as high-risk mothers that we did not fit into the mold of the low-risk women. And we knew as low-risk women that when something happened in our pregnancy and birth, that we then often felt disappointed and upset. We didn't know what had happened. So we developed more extensive skills. We evolved skills that got shut down by the natural birth movement and by the home birth midwifery movement. And they've still been shut down. So now I'm back. What can you do? Well, of course, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, right? Or you can pass this link on to other people. But as a woman or a man who's listening to this, you need to tell your friends and family that it's just normal and natural when you're pregnant to learn skills and use those skills to birth your baby. You don't have to be perfect, but you'll feel better if you're using some skills to work through the activity. That's what you can tell people. It's not a question of don't make choices. It's include skills. Spend an equal or more time, because when birth unfolds, it's about the activity. You might not want pain relief. That's fine. But if you have the skills, you might not need pain relief, or you may have it later, or you may work with the skills anyway. You may not want to be induced, but if you are induced, that takes a fraction of a second. You still have to work through the activity. Your husband or others should be there to help you cope and manage better. They shouldn't be sitting on the sidelines supporting your choices. They can do that too, but they may not understand what you're asking for. They may think it's so fiddly and diddly, and then you might not like those choices, but you have to do the activity. So if you're somebody who's pregnant or know somebody who's pregnant, tell them that the idea and the words and the actions are, because you're pregnant, it's normal and natural, learn some birth skills and use those skills when you give birth to your baby. That's what you do. If you're a birth provider, you have an opportunity to address this to lots and lots of people and spread the word faster. There is never going to be an uprising of women who are going to demand skills. Never. Because you as natural birth movement, and you may not be a natural birth provider, but you in the natural birth movement, natural birth providers, particularly midwives, have spent 50 years telling women they don't need skills. Now you need to tell women we do need skills because we're doing this activity. And we need to reduce the hurdles to achieve an empowered birth. Not suffering is a good goal in itself. Women should not have to avoid medical assessments, monitoring, and procedures to have an empowered birth experience. That just shouldn't be the bottom line. It's mean. Women to women, it's mean. It's just mean. And it's led to women being very gnarly with each other about all elements. I breastfed, you bottle fed. I stayed at home, you went to work. Right? I got up at night 100 times to nurse my baby, and you let your baby cry. We have to stop this. We're women. We have to have dignity as a gender about our pregnancies, about our births, and about how we parent. We have to be generous with one another. So we need to pass this on. So as a birth provider, no matter what your beliefs are, this is the script you give to your clients. Hi, I'm X, you're whoever. I'm here to safeguard the health and well-being of your baby, and I went to school for years to do that. I'm going to do my best to respect your choices, and I appreciate a birth plan. We'll put those in your notes. But you're going to do this activity of birthing your baby. Nobody can do it for you. You can't take a break for lunch. You can't stop for 15 minutes. I can't do it for you. Nobody can. You are doing this activity of birthing your baby, even if it's a planned cesarean. And we want you to have an empowered experience. So here's a list of skills-based methods that I have found for you, local, online, in the library. And if you need help in that, reach out to us and we will help you with this, because our trust is committed to growing a skilled birthing population through the voices of birth professionals. So give them a handout and just say, at 24 weeks, please pick one or more of these skills-based methods and tell me what you learned at 24 weeks. Breathing, wrote it in your notes. 28 weeks, relaxation, wrote it in your notes. 32 weeks, nothing, wrote it in your notes. 36 weeks, meditation. Okay, blingo. Or teamwork, blingo. Or progression of labor, how to cope with the 5 phases of contraction. Blink, whatever. Put that in your notes. At your birth, if you look like you're coping, managing well, and staying on top of it, we are going to praise you. The staff or I, whoever else is with you, we're going to congratulate you, because one, you need to know is that we love working with skilled families. It's a lot easier on us as human beings to be with people who we can talk to and who look like they're coping. Because if you don't look like you're coping, I'm going to want to save you, which means I'm going to want to give you pain relief, or I'm going to want to get this birth over with so you don't suffer and your baby doesn't suffer. So if you are coping well, I'm going to pat you on the back, pat your partner on the back, yippee. If you look like you're suffering or overwhelmed, we can refer to your notes and say, oh, at 24 weeks you learned breathing. Oh, I said I did, but I didn't. Okay, well, there you go. Okay, so we'll do our best. I did, but, I want a natural birth. Now I'm having a lot of interventions. And you, as a provider, just say it's still your baby's birth. Use your breathing skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby. Well, I really wanted to have a vaginal birth, and now I'm on a table having a cesarean. That's okay. This is your baby's birth. Every breath in and every breath out, you can use skills to work through this birth, and you will feel more engaged. You will feel more positive. And then debrief the next time you see the person. So this is how birth professionals can do it. We can't do this alone. I'm 76. I've spent 50 years trying to say this. That's a bloody long period of time. How successful have I been? Not. Why? Because the ideology around childbirth is stuck. And it got stuck in the 60s, and it hasn't progressed. And the idea was to be anti-medical and to believe that women who said no to medical care, who were perceived of as low risk, would just have an easy, safe, enjoyable birth with a good outcome. That was what was considered to be a natural birth. So if, in the present, you want to know what one group of midwives think is the ideal natural birth, here it is. Because when I teach in New Zealand, and I taught midwives, it's an amazing midwifery model of care that sadly is just falling apart since 1990, because the partnership model didn't get based on women becoming skilled. It was only based on choices and midwives giving too much of their time and energy. But when you ask midwives what's stopping natural birth, which is their goal. It's that list of 30 interventions. And when you ask New Zealand midwives, what is your ideal birth? It's this list. And this is where women have to stop being mean to each other. We have to dignify all of our births. There should be no concept of an ideal birth at all. None at all. We should be dignifying the birth of every baby, because our baby is important to us. Our baby is the memories we hold. Our baby's birth is the activity we do. And so therefore, we need to grow a skilled birthing population. So I'm finished talking. Who knows whether anybody's ever going to listen to anything I say, but it's good to get it off of my chest, and I'm going to continue on this You and Childbirth series for a very long time, because there is a very, very, very long list of topics we need to talk about in order to deconfuse this childbirth conversation and get it on the right track. And you play an important part of it. Thank you for listening.